This is why it matters to New Hampshire, don't you think? This is why it matters to all of America, don't you think? So you look at these maps, right? Here you've got the federally controlled lands. More than 50% of all land west of the Rocky Mountains, less than 5% of the land east of the Rocky Mountains controlled by the federal government. This is wilderness and roadless rules here. This is wildfires more than 250 acres. Managed for maximum combustion through museum management. This is $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the Federal Bureaucratic Land Museum. Property Environmental Research Center, just in April of this year, said that by all accounts, our federal lands are in trouble, both in terms of fiscal performance and environmental stewardship. The Forest Service is so busy meeting procedural requirements, they call it the analysis paralysis, the process predicament, management by litigation, that it can't fulfill its mission. I love this part. The federal government, for every dollar that it spends managing public lands, loses 27 cents. You get to pay for that in New Hampshire. For every dollar that the states spend managing the millions of acres of public land that the states already manage, they generate a positive $14.51. You should have seen his reaction over here. There is a solution big enough, right? Of course, the federal government's going to make up the loss by the volume, of course, right? That's how they do things. There is a solution big enough. We're talking about this. We're talking about multiple use public lands. We're not talking about national parks. We're not talking about congressionally designated wilderness. We're not talking about Indian lands. We're not talking about military bases. We're talking about freeing up these lands so they can be managed like a garden by those who know the lands best, who love the lands most, who have the most at stake with 50% of their house locked up to help our neighbors that shouldn't have to pay our food bill because our kitchen is off limits, that shouldn't have to be subject to the liability because we can't get to the gas line when the fire goes to put out the fire. We can't get to the water line that's going to now run and run off forever. We need to free up the lands, and so that Utah lands can be managed by Utahns. Nevada's lands, 85% of them can be managed by Nevadans for the benefit of the whole nation. Now, here's what's fascinating. Just last year, Canada has already done this. Canada discovered, right? They discovered this, that when the decisions over land, water, and resources are made by the people closest to the decision, they get a better decision. They get better economic and better environmental results. Surely in the United States of America, founded on the principles of liberty, property, and self-government, we could be at least as good at protecting those fundamental rights as socialist Canada, don't you think? It's time to free the lands. It matters for our state, it matters for our nation. So where's the line? I've got the little contest for you as we go. If you'll get, I'm going to tell you right now so you can prepare in advance. I've got about 20 or 30 of these little books with me. If you'll go on to AmericanLandsCouncil.org, there's a petition to free the lands. We want better access, better health, better productivity. The first 20 or 30, I think they have them back here, that sign that petition, go back and they'll give you a book, and we'll put the information up here later. So let's look at the basic principles, right? We've been talking all day. Congress, the federal government is a government of enumerated power. It can't do things that weren't delegated, and all powers not delegated are reserved to the states, right? Pretty simple. Now, the principles of our government, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. That means we have an exit interview. If we're endowed by our Creator, that means we're going to answer to that Creator for what we do in blessing other people's lives with what we receive. Our system was based on that. We have an exit interview. We were endowed with unalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which meant property and self-government. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This is why government exists. It doesn't exist to give you stuff. It doesn't exist to take things from this neighbor to give to this neighbor whose kitchen we're locking off. It exists to secure these rights. And it derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Who's that? That's us. Now, that means we're the boss, right? So if we want to be the boss, we have to act like the boss. Simple, right? If we want to be treated like the boss, we have to act like the boss. So this is George Sutherland. He is our only Supreme Court Justice, U.S. Supreme Court Justice from Utah. We're very proud of him. He tells us about these rights. He says, man has three great rights: life, liberty, and property. And they're so interconnected as to be a single right. Because if you give a man his life, but you take away his liberty, you take away all that makes life worth living. If you give him liberty, but take away his property, which is the fruit and the badge of his liberty, you still leave him a slave. Property is the master right. In the United States of America, surely we could free the land for better environmental protection, better economic productivity, national security, can we not? Constitution, then, this is where, in order to protect those rights, this is where powers are delegated to protect those rights. We're going to secure the blessings of liberty not just to ourselves, but to our posterity. And to do that, Congress was given certain rights with respect to land. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, it says, Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation. That means jurisdiction. That means they have the governing right, power, and authority. They have the exclusive right to do that over the District of Columbia and all places purchased by the consent of the legislature for specific purposes. It's not this much authority. It's all places purchased with the consent of the legislature for specific purposes. That's their authority over property. Now, in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, this is in the admission of new states, the rights of and obligations to the states. And in the rights of and obligations to the states, it says, Congress shall have the power to keep the land forever and ever and ever. And it doesn't say that, does it? Congress shall have the power to dispose of the land and make needful rules and regulations for disposing of the land, and don't prejudice any of the claims. In the cases recently, the Supreme Court said that life, liberty, property is held by governments more local, not the federal museum management. The independent power of the states serves as a check on the power of the federal government, and we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding, and states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. That's the Supreme Court last year. So our system of checks and balances. How many of you have seen a chart like this in 8th grade? Right? Executive, legislative, judicial, I know checks and balances, give me the gold star. Well, that's not our government. That's not our government. This is closer to our government. Our government is a compound republic where the power is divided among two distinct governments and they control each other. But that's not the whole story. This is our government. Because in Federalist 45, it says the powers delegated are few and defined, and the powers reserved are numerous and indefinite. How many of you saw a chart like this in 8th grade? Never. That's our government. But if we don't know our government, we get this. Rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. Rights we don't exercise are no better than rights we don't have. James Wilson said, in the Constitution, we drew the line with as much accuracy as was possible. So does the federal government have authority to control Western lands? No, indeed they do not. How did they get to hold lands anyway? They're in the middle of the Revolution. Revolutionary War. This is where the public land question started. They're in the middle of the Revolutionary War. 7 states have claim to Western lands, 6 don't. How many of you have children? If you give lollipops to some of your children but not others, does that work out well? No, it doesn't, does it? It doesn't. So the states put the lands in trust to fund the Revolutionary War. The federal government merely held the lands in trust. Supreme Court has said as much. They hold it in trust for the states ultimately to be created. We're going to skip through some of these. So this is what the Western lands used to look like. Michigan, Iowa, Louisiana, that great western state of Florida over there, you see that? 90% federally controlled for decades. They're not like that anymore. Their complaints, we can't educate our kids. We can't grow our economy. You're hoarding all of our lands. Our people are leaving the state. That was Florida's resolution to Congress. It was one man. One man stood up. Thomas Hart Benton. He was a Democrat from Missouri. Thomas Hart Benton said, my election to the Senate found me doing battle for changing this system of disposing of the public lands. I resolved to move against the whole system. I did it in a bill, but more so it was speaking to the bosses and getting them energized so they could hire and inspire leaders with knowledge and courage to move forward on the only solution big enough for our nation. He says the federal government was a monopolizer of the vacant lands of the West. He's talking about Florida and Louisiana and Illinois. And like all monopolies, it results in a hardship. But the members of Congress, and I would submit the presidential nominees that you're going to select here in New Hampshire, should fix their eyes steadily on the period of the speedy extinction of the federal title to all the lands within their boundaries, and they did. And they did. I'm here in New Hampshire so that you will pick the next Thomas Hart Benton to be the nominee for President of the United States so that we can get to better environmental protection of our lands. We can get to economic independence, energy independence. We can control our own destiny on our national security. You have the blessing and opportunity to pick the Thomas Hart Benton for the next 4 years in the United States of America. Quickly, I want to why does it matter? What do these things have in common? What do these things have in common? Richard Sherman, NFC Championship game, he gets his arm blasted in the game. He's doubled over in pain the rest of the game, but he stays in the game. If you're Aaron Rodgers with the Green Bay Packers and the best player on the other team has just got his arm disabled and he's not coming out of the game, what do? You go after him all game long. What if the whole backfield has one arm, two arms, maybe two arms and a leg, like Nevada, 85% broken up? You take advantage of that all day long, right? Payment in lieu of taxes. Remember the kitchen is off limits and you all get to pay for their kitchen not being accessible? That's called payment in lieu of taxes. Payment in lieu of the taxes that the western states would generate if Congress had kept the original promise to dispose of the land. It's about $400 million. When Harry Reid wanted to increase food stamps just last year, $756 billion, do you know how much it cost Congress? What $1 trillion cost Congress? It cost them $400 million. For $400 million, they round up all the Western votes and they increase the burden on you by $756 billion. Because the Western states can't exist without that pittance. Because in Garfield County, they only have 3% taxable land. 3% taxable land. In politics, if you're exploitable, you will be exploited. So you think about this, right? Is the solution to that to get a better rider? What if you just had a stronger rider? What if you just veered that bicycle a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left? No, we have a system problem, right? We have a system problem. It is critical. The line must be drawn by the states themselves. It will be the states' own faults if they let the federal government interfere in the things of their respective jurisdictions. To close, we'll end with this, a couple of these slides here. Harry Truman, we don't propose, like some people, to meet today's problems by saying they don't exist, and tomorrow's problems by wishing that tomorrow would never come when that $18 trillion bill comes due. Men make history and not the other way around. In periods where there's no leadership, society stands still, or over the last 8 years goes backwards, perhaps. Progress occurs when skillful, courageous leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. To hire a Thomas Hart Benton, that we take the environmental initiative and not kill millions of animals a year, burn tens of millions of acres, destroy watershed, protect communities, protect our recreation areas. Here's where you can go on the petition. I've got those books. I've got 20 to 30 of those books. The first ones you can actually text and sign the petition. And I'm just going to finish with this. Will you please here, I want you to, as you vet these candidates, would you please contact me, info@AmericanLandsCouncil.com, and let me know who you think is the next Thomas Hart Benton so that we can tell the nation as they come west and as they go. Because this is not just a Western issue. Let me finish with this. Ronald Reagan, height of the Cold War. Red phones, Russia, it was tense. If he were here today, he would tell us the very same thing. This is a wonderful time to be alive. We are lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something. For liberty and freedom and fairness and the master right, which is property. These are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, out to seize back a country and a world of freedom. Thank you very much. Sure. Oh, no, that's not. Sorry.
So we move this program along. How great was he, huh? Awesome job. Thanks, Ken.
Crop TV.